Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined this evening by two excellent guests. Firstly, by writer and academic Effie Samara. Effie, how are you doing this evening?
I'm good, Kenny, thank you. How are you?
I'm not bad. And on the other side of me, joining us from London, we have the MP for Gordon, Richard Thomson. Richard, how are you doing?
Not bad, Kenny. Not bad.
Excellent. Well, we start this evening, as we always do, with our coronavirus statistics update. And as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 693,038 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 670,022 were confirmed negative, 23,016 were positive. There were 267 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today and one new reported death. This will be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all of those with symptoms will necessarily get tested. Although, as we always do, we urge you, if you are showing symptoms of a new persistent cough, a change in your sense of taste or smell, and a fever, then please do book a test as quickly as you can. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 48 people in hospital last night, 6 of whom were in intensive care. You'll notice that that number is a lot lower than the numbers we've been reporting for some time. That's because there's a new method of reporting. The Scottish Government is now only reporting people who have active cases of COVID-19. The previous numbers reported people who were still in hospital having recovered from the virus. And the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 2,500. This number only includes those who have died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures available show that 41,664 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from the illness, an increase of 27 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. And we also have today's report from the Office for National Statistics on deaths in England and Wales for the week ending the 4th of September, which was week 36 of the year. The total number of deaths in England and Wales for the week was more than 15% below the 5-year average for this time of year. This is thought to be because this week included the late August bank holiday, meaning significantly fewer deaths being registered than usual. A total of 78 death certificates issued in that week mentioned the novel coronavirus. This is the fewest coronavirus deaths registered in England and Wales since week 11 in mid-March, when the first pandemic deaths were registered. This compares with a daily tally of 51 deaths reported for the same week. And just before we get on to the rest of today's headlines, if you'd like to join the conversation here, you can do so on Twitter by following us at Broadcast Scot and using the hashtag Scotland at 7. That's hashtag Scotland AT and the number 7. And as you can see, we'll be flashing some of those tweets up on the screen throughout the show as we go on. But our first story tonight, the SNP has said it is a democratic outrage that the Tories are forcing a power grab through against Scotland's will, after Scotland's Parliament and an overwhelming majority of Scotland's MPs voted against the UK Internal Market Bill. As the bill reaches committee stage today, the SNP will table a series of amendments to exempt Scotland from provisions that infringe on the devolution settlement, while continuing to oppose the power grab bill in its entirety. The SNP amendments would exempt Scotland from the provisions of Part 4 of the bill, which would allow an unelected body set up by Westminster to pass judgment on Holyrood laws, opening the door for companies to take legal action to strike down Scottish Parliament legislation. The amendments would also prevent the Competition and Markets Authority from acting without legislative approval from the devolved parliaments. So, Richard, I think I'll come to you first on this. This obviously is one of the reasons you're down in Westminster right now trying to deal with this. What's been the feeling in Westminster since this debate last night, this vote last night? Is there a sense of triumph from the Tory benches, and is there any hope on the opposition benches that this can be stopped now?
Well, I don't think there's hope it can be stopped. What we want to do is to highlight all the areas where this rides roughshod over the devolution settlement, not in any great expectation of winning some of the votes that are coming up in the committee stage, which we're now in, but hope to grab the attention of folks back home about what is really going to be the end effect of Brexit for Scotland's Parliament. Now, Westminster, as we know, is grabbing powers on the way past from Europe. It's been a long-standing principle of devolution that that which is not reserved is devolved. And so therefore, the powers that are coming back from Brussels should be going directly to the devolved assemblies, particularly the Scottish Parliament, but that's not what is happening. So there's that aspect. But this bill goes considerably further. It's looking to encroach on several areas of devolved competencies to try and, well, you could be very cynical about it. I will be very cynical about it. It's looking to find ways to put money into certain projects in Scotland. Now, this will not be new money, potentially, but it's reserving the right to take up economic development functions or functions in education, investment in infrastructure. And there's a very, very real possibility, which we'll get into tomorrow, that because it won't be new money almost certainly, you could see existing Scottish Government budgets top-sliced, like you do with the Scotland Office, only to that money then being invested, whether it's in line with the Scottish Government, democratically elected Scottish Government's priorities or not, and most likely it probably will not, and then putting a great big by the UK Government sticker on the side of whatever results. It's a pretty transparent and tawdry tactic that rides roughshod over devolution. And I think the point to get out of this is it's not getting rid of the Scottish Parliament, but it's parking its tanks in the Scottish Parliament's lawn. And I think for anyone who is not yet convinced of independence, they need to have a good look at this bill. And those of us who are convinced of independence should help those who are not yet convinced of independence see exactly what is happening in this bill. And there's been a distinct irony throughout the railing of backbench Tories against unelected bureaucrats and bureaucrats, that you're going to end up with this all-powerful competition and markets authorities that is as unelected and as bureaucratic as they come, which will, as you say, be playing the front role in terms of pushing down standards and going for the lowest common denominator in legislation, and striking down legislation and striking down public expenditure in public bodies right across the UK. I think the Tories leadership are worried that they might still not get it through. The breaking of international law with regard to the Good Friday Agreement is causing an awful lot of more experienced Tory backbenchers a lot of angst and heartache, whether or not they can vote for that. So I think the Tory whips are still a little bit unsure whether they're going to get the bill at the end of it, if that is still in there. But for the most part, I think there's just been a general parade of cluelessness from Tory backbenchers reading out their speeches. They really don't understand what it is they're voting for, but it's our job to make sure that folk understand that the folks at home can spread that information, because this is going to be the biggest recruiting sergeant we get to persuade people who were devolutionists but not yet supporters of independence that independence is where we need to go if we wish to protect our parliament.
And Richard, this is the Conservative Party, which for as long as it's existed has been the party of law and order, the party of doing things slowly and carefully, being conservative. And yet here we see them tearing up the constitutional settlement, threatening peace in Northern Ireland, and brazenly breaking international law. I mean, what has happened to the Tory party?
Well, frankly, the lunatics have taken over the asylum. I think it's, you could see much that Boris Johnson carried out prior to the election of anyone who dared disagree with him on his withdrawal agreement, the purge of the moderates. And the irony is that he's now telling everyone who wanted to stand as a Conservative Party candidate had to sign this pledge that they would support his agreement. And now he's telling all those self-same candidates who got elected to Westminster that actually they've now got to vote against the agreement that he put in place and completely redesign it from top to bottom. So I think the Tory party is unrecognisable from the cautious evolutionary party that once reserved. It's now become an exclusively English nationalist party almost. And they're absolutely full of the idea that international law doesn't matter, that Westminster is sovereign, they are the masters of the universe, what they say goes, the rest of the world has to bend the shape, and thinking that if there's any consequences from their behaviour, as the other countries enact by following their interests, that somehow that is other countries not playing fair. It's a worldview which manages to be incubated and preserved within the world's rarefied environment of Westminster and the right-wing tabloid press. It doesn't survive any contact with reality in the outside world. But as yet, Brexit has not yet had that collision with reality.
And Effie, obviously, reaction to this bill has been very dramatic. We've seen, for example, politicians in the US saying that there would be no trade deal with the UK under any circumstances if peace in Northern Ireland is threatened. Clearly, a lot of people in Scotland are going to react badly to this and have reacted badly. What do you think the reaction generally will be, and what effect do you think that might have on the way the Tories are acting just now?
Well, I don't think that the Tories are going to change tack at all, Kenny. It seems that they started this on a very authoritarian, almost you would argue totalitarian paradigm. And they will keep on pursuing this. They have even indicated, I believe, and I'm sure that Richard must have heard this firsthand, where anyone stating that they may be deviating or considering not voting for this bill, they may withdraw the whip. So we're talking about, obviously, they have a very large majority, so they can afford to voice these threats and people will take heed. But as you said, I'm not quite sure where the logic is in this, because other than posh boy anarchy, this is not going to lead anywhere, be it from the United States side. We have heard Nancy Pelosi. We have also heard Republican members of the House in America talk voice huge amount of critique against any attempt to interfere with the Good Friday Agreement. As we know, the Irish contingent is very powerful in the United States, and the Good Friday Agreement was sponsored by Bill Clinton and the Irish contingent in America, and they feel very passionate about this. Now, to answer your question, I don't think the Tories live in the present moment, as it were. I will echo everything that Richard said. The lunatics have taken over the asylum. They don't really care what you and I think, or even be it the collective consciousness. They've taken leave of that side of the argument because of their majority and because of the way they wish to govern. So it remains to be seen what happens, but this is a very, very scary bill. And I will add one very small point on all the brilliant commentary of Richard's just a minute ago. The bill also threatens the body of the Act of the Union. This isn't just about the specifics and the minutiae of devolution as it stands at the moment. But Clause 14 of the Act of Union it protects the Scottish court's ability to review legislation and to exert have jurisdictional justiciable powers over the matters that concern Scotland. Now, this particular bill threatens the stability of that, and it's a very, very serious concern.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we do move on and we stay at Westminster, though, where the UK Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has been accused of losing control of attempts to stem the rising tide of COVID-19, as Whitehall comes under fresh fire over its handling of the country's testing system. In a bruising Commons encounter, Hancock said there had been a sharp rise in demand and explained that testing for patients with acute medical needs and people in care homes would be prioritised. The Health Secretary said there were operational challenges in the testing system and admitted problems could take weeks to resolve. Hancock was also forced to warn against attempts to game the system after an MP highlighted that people in southwest London had succeeded in obtaining tests there after being advised to input an Aberdeen postcode when booking. It comes after it emerged that people in England's 10 worst hit coronavirus hotspots were unable to get tests on Monday, prompting claims that the system was a shambles. Health leaders have also warned that a lack of testing is contributing to staff absences across the NHS, putting other services at risk. It was reported yesterday that Hancock had attempted to limit test availability in Scotland through UK government testing centres, but the Scottish Government claims it was able to avoid that outcome through negotiations over the weekend. So, Richard, coming to you on this, there has been obviously criticism of the UK government's handling of testing for some time for various different problems. But it does now seem that this surge in testing, as more people are getting back to work, as schools and universities start to prepare to go back in England, do you think Hancock has handled this well? Do you think are things he needs to do better? What's been your feeling about this discussion?
Well, I'll take a longer view of Matt Hancock, and I have to say I was very, very surprised when I saw Matt Hancock being lauded as one of the so-called adults in the room in Boris Johnson's government. He's not somebody that gives me a huge amount of confidence in anything that he says or he does, and he can be incredibly patronising at the ballot box, even and especially to Dr. Philippa Whitford, who leads for the SNP at Westminster on that. Now, obviously, Philip was a consultant surgeon. You would think that somebody who's a jobbing politician who finds themselves temporarily in that role might find it in them to have at least a little bit of respect for somebody's professional experience, but he doesn't have that. It just seems to be a huge arrogance in the sense that he is entitled to be there and anything he does is good. It leads to the best of all possible outcomes and the best of all possible worlds. I would be inclined to cut him a little bit more slack if it were not for some of the blatant politicisation that goes on in terms of the UK government and its outreach trying to pick faults in the response of the Scottish government. And I think I would be inclined to cut him a little bit more slack if there was a little bit more quiet competence and less attempts to spin things. I mean, we've heard about world-beating apps where we're going to send the coronavirus packing at Westminster. There's now going to be a moonshot that's cost £1 billion that will give everyone rapid, test results and allow us to get back to more of a semblance of what used to be regarded normality. Quite frankly, I think folk are pig sick of it, and they just want to see, as the Times editorial said a couple of days ago, people would just like to see a period of quiet competence. Sadly, I don't think Matt Hancock is the minister to do that.
Well, we still in Westminster, a former Tory MP, Charlie Elphicke, has been sentenced to 2 years in prison for 3 counts of sexual assault against 2 women. Elphicke, who represented Dover from 2010 until last year, was convicted in July of the charges, 2 of which relate to a parliamentary worker in 2016 and the other to an incident at his family home with another woman in 2007. The judge, Mrs. Justice Whipple, said the first victim had faced a terrifying episode when Elphicke chased her around his home chanting, "I'm a naughty Tory," after assaulting her. Whipple also described his behaviour as a campaign of harassment against his other victim, as it had required him to plan ways to get himself alone with her. Elphicke had the Tory whip withdrawn in 2017 when the allegations first came to light, but had it reinstated before a confidence vote in then Prime Minister Theresa May in 2018. It was withdrawn again when legal proceedings began. Effie, if I can come to you on this. Obviously, this case has dragged on for a couple of years, but Charlie Elphicke now at least is out of Parliament, in jail. That's got to be some sort of positive step, isn't it?
Obviously, yes, of course, it's great, and it must be a huge relief to obviously his victims. This is not a very easy subject, Kenny, for any woman to discuss. This goes back to, sadly, I will comment on one item here, which is the amount of time it takes for these cases to be adjudicated and for some justice, some degree of justice to be administered. Now, this is the issue here. And what happens through the course of these long delays is that, not in the particular case, but what we see in criminal law is that you get things like victim fatigue, you get witnesses disappearing somewhere along the line, you get all sorts of things which can affect a victim's testimony very adversely. So I think it is good news, obviously, that he is behind bars. However, there is a necessity and an urgency. We've been talking about this be it in academic discourse or in jurisdiction and legal discourse in jurisprudence for a good 30, 40 years now. There needs to be an overhaul in terms of these cases and of the law in regards both to harassment and rape. These are serious cases, and especially for people in power, like Elphick. I mean, you described a grotesque scene of the, the tourists chasing you, or, a naughty Tory or whatever it is. But, thinking of the victims here, this will probably stay with her for the rest of her life. So there needs to be a review, and it's obviously, we keep saying this, but at some point we have to sit down and do it. It's quite urgent.
And Richard, obviously you're in Westminster, and we've heard lots of reports over the last couple of years coming out about endemic problems in politics, with junior parliamentary workers being harassed by older, more powerful men. Do you get the feeling that these things are getting better at all, that there are now avenues for women to make complaints and be heard?
I'm probably not the person to ask on that, but I would say that there's certainly a very conscious effort on behalf of the parliamentary authorities to try and make sure that people know the difference between acceptable and unacceptable behaviour, and also to give people who work here the opportunity to know what support is there, and that to empower them to say when things are not okay, and to know where they can get help and support if they want to make a complaint about it. I think the situation isn't helped that an awful lot of really quite ordinary folk find themselves propelled into Parliament. And I think if you make the mistake of thinking that you're something special after you get there, that's when the trouble can really start. And the problem is that parliamentary staff are employed directly by the MP, so it's not as if there's a pool of staff for a professional HR organisation. There's certainly professional HR advice there, but the MP becomes the employer, in effect. And that, I think, is not always a healthy situation. I mean, you'll get some MPs who are fantastic employers, and I would hope to be thought of as one of those myself, but it can make it very, very difficult if you're unhappy with your treatment. I can see that. Where would people go to complain if they didn't feel they could confide in a colleague, or if they didn't know that there were avenues there through the parliamentary HR services to take that route. So it's not a healthy set of employment circumstances even yet, I would argue, simply because of that claustrophobic nature between and close-knit team. Now, you need to have a close-knit team that you can trust, but has Parliament got the HR implications of that all right? Possibly not yet. But one thing I would say is that every MP and peer on coming back in September was very, very strongly encouraged to go on a training course to help them understand the difference, if anyone needed to be helped along that route, on the difference between acceptable, unacceptable behaviour, power imbalances and how things could be misinterpreted, and how suddenly you finding yourself in a position of power, you may not think that you have changed, but certainly the way that other people perceive you and your words and your actions is very, very different as a result of the status that you now have. I think I used to work here 10 years ago. MPs were almost like demigods at that time. It's certainly not that way now, and that is a very, very positive change. But has the Westminster Parliament got it right yet? Almost certainly not. But the positive thing is there is an awareness, and I think there's a far, far greater willingness to call it out and to make sure that the avenues are open to help people who sadly find themselves in that situation are taken advantage of.
Yeah. We should just note, by the way, that Charlie Elphick has sought leave to appeal and has been granted it, so he is appealing those charges. We have to make that clear for legal reasons. But we move on now, and the SNP has said the Tory government has been too slow to act to save jobs, as rising unemployment hit a 2-year high. New figures from the Office for National Statistics show unemployment has risen to 4.1%, as redundancies rise sharply, and the number of people in paid employment in the UK has fallen by 695,000 since March, including 156,000 fewer 16 to 24-year-olds in employment. The publication of the new ONS UK labour market figures today follows a warning from the Institute for Employment Studies yesterday that it expects almost 500,000 redundancies to take place this autumn. Richard, coming back to you on this, this is a real terrifying sign, this depth of unemployment hitting us now, when we know there's a strong likelihood that it's going to get worse next month when furlough ends, and then potentially even worse going into the winter, perhaps a second wave of the virus, and the Brexit crisis that's going to hit then. How big of a problem is this, and what does the government need to do to respond to it?
Well, it's a huge problem. Demand is everything in the government has spent to try and maintain demand. You know, the scale of the response was appropriate. Even I've quibbled on this show previously about the detail of the Chancellor's response, but there was never going to be any getting away from the fact that an economic hit was going to land, and I think we're seeing that coming through in the lack of business confidence, a lack of consumer confidence, and it's only going to get worse, as you say, if when the furlough drops off. We're going to see an awful lot of jobs that have been sustained, and for what, you have to ask yourself if the support is just going to be pulled away as the Chancellor plans. SNP has been very clear we need to maintain the furlough scheme. It can't carry on forever, obviously, but we need to maintain the furlough scheme in key sectors to protect employment as demand comes back, and also we need to be able to not be afraid of the consequences of bringing restrictions back as and when we need them in order to try and avoid that second peak that we've worried about for months. With the restrictions of in public gatherings of 6 people from 2 households that's just been brought in Scotland, it's not radically different from what's happening in England or Wales or the Netherlands or lots of other places. But there are now businesses that do events in my constituency that had been making a tentative comeback that are now finding that they're not going to be able to operate as they intended with that. And there's no additional support that's been announced from the UK government to try and counter that. It's difficult, of course, because of the Revolution is funded for the Scottish government to do that out of already committed budgets. So I just worry that we're about to take a bad situation and make it worse with the withdrawing of furlough, potentially any further additional shock that comes from a second wave, whether that's dramatic or whether it builds up more incrementally. And then, of course, we're looking at the cumulative impact of hard Brexit at this point in time on top of that. I think it's going to get an awful lot worse before it gets better because of the actions that the Chancellor is not taking and not continuing with.
Mm-hmm. And Effie, just quite quickly, we've talked about this subject numerous times on the show. We've seen the SNP and other parties making this same argument for months now. Do you get the feeling that there's any chance Rishi Sunak is listening?
No, he never listens. He is Rishi Sunak, although he's very articulate and young and educated, is very much part of that group of ultra-conservatives who are under the Cummings/Johnson spell. So you're not going to get any different tune from Sunak. He's under orders to do as he's told. I think that, as Richard indicated, this is going to get worse. And I will say that there are different ways of doing this. Anecdotally, I was just on Zoom to a theatre group in Berlin just before I came on this show. And I was told that one of the participants, for health reasons, is not going to be able to work until 2022, and there is full furlough in place for such groups. So there are ways of dealing with this, but the Conservative government are taking a political decision here, and hopefully they will reap the consequences.
Well, we move on now, and SNP MP Gavin Newlands has called again on the UK government to take urgent action to protect thousands of workers by banning the exploitative practice of firms firing staff and then rehiring them on significantly reduced terms. The renewed call comes after Keir Starmer followed the SNP's lead and also urged the UK government to outlaw these hire and rehire tactics in his speech at the Trade Unions Congress. The MP's Employment, Dismissal and Re-employment Bill, which has cross-party support and the backing of major UK trade unions including Unite, BALPA and GMB Scotland, is a response to companies including Centrica and British Airways that are looking at plans to lay off and then rehire thousands of workers on diminished terms due to the coronavirus pandemic. As the furlough scheme winds down, the Paisley and Renfrewshire North MP also renewed calls for Rishi Sunak to extend the support measures into 2021, warning that prematurely cutting back the schemes could lead to job losses on a scale not seen since the 1980s. And Richard, this does obviously tie into what we were saying before about the furlough scheme, but this is a really unpleasant tactic that some companies are using. Gavin Newlands has been fighting it very hard for months. Have you seen any progress at Westminster in terms of getting the government on board with this?
No, I think there's a broad sympathy here because even some of the more hard Tories, they find it very, very hard. They'll mount a stout defence of capitalism and free markets. They find it very difficult to in favour of some of the behaviour of the poor corporate behaviour that you find out there. So I think there's a lot of sympathy for this, although the bill was, as a private member's bill, stood very little chance of making it onto the statute book. I mean, the only SNP MP who has ever managed to get something into legislation was Dr. Ely Whiteford, with trying to get the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women incorporated into domestic UK and Scottish law. So I think there's a lot of sympathy for the intent behind Gavin's bill. I mean, I've seen the fire and rehire tactic used because in an absence of other legal remedies, and I've seen that used in my time in local government. But what differentiates from any time I've seen it used there to what's happening in British Airways is the sheer scale that it's happening now. My understanding is that British Airways, there's maybe about 3 different types of staff contract out there, and British Airways are using it. That's certainly the case in Centrica, with multiple contracts going back over many years with different conditions. But what British Airways are trying to do is just simply unilaterally change the terms and conditions of their staff, many of whom have worked very, very loyally for the company for years, quite old-fashioned in that sense. Nobody has a job for life, but at the same time, if you're given years of commitment to a company, to an organisation, to anything, you're due to be treated with a great deal more respect than British Airways is treating its workforce. So I would like to see Gavin's bill discussed and passed to make sure that this sort of wholesale abuse of the dismissal and re-engage procedure cannot be used in the manner in which British Airways is using it and which Centrica has threatened. Because let's face it, it is not a conducive way of productive, mutually beneficial negotiations with unions and workers' representatives and management.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of businesses behaving badly, our next story, the SNP's Shadow Chancellor has today welcomed the decision of the High Court to find in favour of policyholders by the Financial Conduct Authority with regard to business insurance claims rejected by a number of insurers. Alison Thulis had previously written to the FCA's interim chief executive Christopher Woolard in April, urging the regulator to apply more pressure in respect of these insurance providers who had refused to settle claims where businesses had been left out of pocket, despite having policies that they believed covered pandemic and disease risk. Effie, I mean, this case, insurers just refusing to pay out on policies that businesses were apparently quite reasonably believed did cover them if a pandemic meant they had to shut down their business. We have now seen this decision made. Do you expect insurers to snap into action and pay out the way they're meant to?
I didn't catch the last part of your question, Kenny. Sorry.
I was just asking if you expect the insurers to now do the right thing.
No, I think it will be an interesting one to watch. There will have to be quite a lot of political pressure exerted on them, I believe. Obviously, it is a business decision. So where they stand to lose and they can find a way out, they will most definitely look for that. And obviously, COVID, there is, I understand, no legal precedent in terms of pandemics. And a lot of these policies would have specified there would be a small print there for exclusions or what have you. So the devil will be in the detail. But with political pressure, I think this can can bear some fruit, but it will be one which will have quite a bit of attention will have to be paid to it.
And Richard, I mean, we've heard, we've all experienced, in fact, insurance companies that try their best to find a way not to pay out. Do you think this is something where the insurance industry maybe needs to take a look at the way it structures these policies?
Possibly. I think that it's like there's a cliche, you've never met a poor bookmaker.
Yeah.
And in the same sense, it's very, very difficult to find examples of if insurance companies are run properly, struggling to pay out, because any responsible insurance company should always be hedging the liabilities it's taking on, and it's always able to adjust its risk rates for its premiums, going forward. So while it's a significant natural disaster, you would expect companies to have to dig deep with their backers. For those who have taken out for those that are providing business interruption cover, the possibility that one day they might have to pay out on an event like this ought not to surprise. And yes, it will put a dent in the balance sheet for a year or two, but fundamentally people are looking to be insured, they're looking to have risks assured, and the companies over the piece should be able to do that and still make the margins that are required. So quite simply, I think they need to, the companies should just take this one. Quite apart from the fact that it's terribly bad public relations coverage for them, they should take the hit, because most of these companies have got very, very strong parent backers, and over the piece the market works in such a way that it's very, very difficult for the companies not to make the profit that they're looking for over that piece, while serving that useful function of spreading and kind of socialising that risk. So take the hit, because over the piece the companies win more often don't. That's why they're in business.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving on now, the world has failed to meet a single target to stem the destruction of wildlife and life-sustaining ecosystems in the last decade, according to a devastating new report from the UN on the state of nature. From tackling pollution to protecting coral reefs, the international community did not fully achieve any of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets agreed in Aichi, Japan in 2010 to slow the loss of the natural world. It is the second consecutive decade when governments have failed to meet such targets. The Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, published before a key UN summit on the issue later this month, found that despite progress in some areas, natural habitats have continued to disappear, vast numbers of species remain threatened by extinction from human activities, and $500 billion of environmentally damaging government subsidies have not been eliminated. 6 targets have been partially achieved, including those on protected areas and invasive species. While governments did not manage to protect 17% of terrestrial and inland water areas and 10% of marine habitats, 44% of vital biodiverse areas are now under protection, an increase from 29% in the year 2000. About 200 successful eradications of invasive species on islands have also taken place. Effie, this kind of story is just really grim news. We've known about these problems for decades, and yet in the last decade we haven't been able to hit a single target. Why do you think the world is failing to take these issues seriously enough?
It's been a problem to do with corporate interests, especially historically, Kenny, going back through the 60s and the 70s. I'm actually working on a piece right now and using some of that information. Very large oil companies were aware of climate and biodiversity problems and other issues. Very, very aware through the 70s and the early 80s, and they specifically funded marketing campaigns to diverge away from these issues. Also in America, let's not forget the very heavy lobbying that takes place in regards to every single member of the House of Representatives. Now, they will have to be attached to specific corporations in order to be able to get elected. And these corporations will have stipulations as to how they will support and sponsor a candidate. So a lot of this marketing stuff and a lot of the research has been directed via America or by America or through America. So there has been a very, very big issue with the way research is approached and research is commissioned. So in terms of how we look at it is what is being reported to us. And in terms of obviously, European governments, Europe has fundamentally always been more open to these questions, Scandinavian countries. But again, despite the knowledge being available for a good 20, 30 or 40 years, we have been very late in taking action. I think it's to do fundamentally with economic interests, but also governments do not wish to be seen to be taking action which may be perceived by their voters as non-user friendly, if you like. So if you tell people not to use their cards very much or to limit foreign travel or whatever, this may not be perceived as a good policy. So people are very, very careful to preserve both their interests, but also the economic interests that they represent. It's a delicate one, but right now it has become an urgent one.
And Richard, I mean, we are talking about a global scale here, and a lot of the countries that are most at risk in a lot of these situations are often not the richest countries. Do richer countries like the UK, the US, maybe some of the rest of Europe, need to take a more proactive approach in helping other countries to meet their targets here?
I think we do. It's one of the reasons I'm so disappointed that the recent decision by the Conservative government here in the West to merge the Foreign Office with the Department for International Development. I don't think we should be critical of a desire in other parts of the world, less well-off parts of the world, to emulate the lifestyles that we've come to take for granted. But just as we're living a completely unsustainable lifestyle in the West. I think the question for me is, how do we help people meet legitimate aspirations for better lives, a better material standard of living, a more equitable sharing of resources in a way that doesn't outstrip the capacity of the planet to provide it. Now, that's going to mean better technologies, better use of energy, and using the wealth that has been accumulated by fair means and by foul means in the West over many, many decades and centuries to try and balance that development out. Also, in order to make an active decision to try and protect some of that biodiversity, because we don't live in isolation. If we're with the pollution that we produce, or with the waste we produce, the resources that we overexploit at a rate that the planet can't regenerate them at, we are all literally living in this together. We don't have an alternative here. So I think we should be doing more to help people live better lives, to help countries to develop as they wish to develop, but in a way which is sustainable at the same time as we make ourselves sustainable, so that we are getting a far more equitable balance of resources, and that those that we're no longer exploiting large parts of the world for resources simply because we have the money to pay in order to get that from the structures that are in place. So I think there is a great deal that must be done, that needs to be done, that isn't being done. I don't think merging the departments in the way that happened is the best way to show leadership on that. We should be separating those development goals and helping and people to achieve their development goals, separating that from any separate foreign policy objectives that might be there. It's too important to bundle that up with politics.
Absolutely. Well, we come back to Scotland now, but much the same subject. An overwhelming majority of Scots view climate change as an immediate and urgent problem, according to the Scottish Household Survey. The study shows that the proportion of adults viewing climate change as an immediate and urgent problem has risen from 46% in 2013 to 68% in 2019, prompting the Scottish Greens to call on the Scottish Government to stop tinkering and deliver bold climate action. Scottish Green co-leader Patrick Harvey said, "An overwhelming majority of Scots in every age group now recognise that the climate emergency is an immediate and urgent problem. It's time for the Scottish Government to stop tinkering at the edges and finally deliver an emergency response. We've shown how climate action can support hundreds of thousands of jobs, deliver a fair transition for those currently working in fossil fuel industries, and make our villages, towns and cities healthier places to live. All that's missing is government will." So, Richard, I'll come to you first on this as well. Do you feel that the Scottish Government is doing enough, or are the Greens right to call for further action, further dramatic action?
Well, I'm satisfied the Scottish Government's doing, but that doesn't mean that more can't be done and that the Scottish Government is immune from fair-minded criticism of or suggestions about what else it could be doing. I think that the Scottish Government certainly has recognised the need to tackle carbon emissions through transportation. That's one of the biggest single sources of emissions. So the phasing out of new petrol and diesel cars, the decarbonisation of the rail network, whether that's through electrification or greater use of hydrogen trains, I think that all of that is good. I think the investment in the industrial strategy, it doesn't always get the best press, and money's going into companies like Bifab or Ferguson Marine, but there's a huge amount done in terms of decarbonising marine transport, where Scotland is very well placed to lead on that. We need to be industrialising the environmental technologies of the future so that we've got the scale to do that. We had the scale to do that onshore in Scotland and didn't achieve it. We've also got the scale to do that offshore and to export that. So there are tremendous industrial opportunities here in that just transition. That's particularly important for me, of course, as somebody who represents the north east of Scotland, where tens of thousands of people are employed directly and indirectly through the North Sea. That number of jobs can still be sustained by moving towards a greener future. The carbon capture technology that we need in the future, it will be a transitional technology perhaps, but the Acorn project in Peter's in pole position to be able to start delivering on that carbon sequestration, delivering on blue hydrogen to kickstart the hydrogen economy and decarbonise aspects of that natural gas extraction. Again, we're well placed for that, providing it has the government support to bring all parts of that market together, because it requires huge investment. We're well placed to put in the high voltage DCs that can decarbonise oil and gas extraction. That's a significant part of the emissions from oil and gas is actually in the extraction process itself. That, of course, makes it easier to connect renewable technologies to the grid for domestic use or export. So I think there's an awful lot of good things happening. The government in Scotland has shown the appropriate lead on that. Could we do more? Almost certainly. And I think that's part of the constructive tension, that there needs to be that dialogue in terms of what else could we do and how much faster could we do it. So I'm quite content with that dialogue and what the Greens and others are doing to make the Scottish Government more ambitious. Certainly it is ambitious, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be more so.
Absolutely. We have another Scottish Household Survey story. Most people are happy with their neighbourhood, feel a strong sense of belonging, and think their local heritage is well cared for, according to the latest Scottish Household Survey. Concern about the environment has continued to grow, particularly among young people. The survey found that last year, 69% of 16 to 24-year-olds agreed climate change was an immediate and urgent problem, up from 38% in 2013. Meanwhile, more people were online than ever before, including older people, with 66% of over 60s now using the internet. However, the most common cultural activity was reading, with 62% of adults having read in the year before the survey was undertaken. The survey found that 94% of adults said their neighbourhood was a good or fairly good place to live, while 78% said they felt a strong sense of belonging there. Satisfaction with local schools rose to 73% from 71% in 2018, while satisfaction with public transport increased from 65% to 68%. And 90% of people were culturally engaged, either by attending or visiting a cultural event or place, or by participating in a cultural activity. So, Effie, I'll come to you on this. Do you think this sounds like the Scotland you live in?
Oh, absolutely, of course. Yes. It's there's a huge, obviously there's a huge big difference, Kenny. I was just thinking about this just as you were reading out the item about the England where I've lived most of my life, and then the Scotland where I'm raising my daughter. And there's a huge difference between an area which is in terms of sort of square kilometers, if you like, quite similar. But I'm just thinking back, there was absolutely no connection to my neighbours going from Oxford to Surrey, in the two big places where I've lived. There was simply a very cold, hello, and that was that. There was no community engagement. There was no, and obviously all of this is anecdotal, but there you have it. The research has just borne that out as you've just read it. However, what's very interesting is that obviously, I am in a small village, and that's fantastic. But what I'm witnessing is the community spirit, which is translated through the schools, the support that you receive for even the smallest thing. I remember the very first week of the lockdown, we had two little pieces of paper come through my front door saying, if you need any help with shopping, or, please call this number. And it was a very moving thing to receive and take into your hands and actually read and realize that these were real people putting themselves out there to do this. I will say, I will just add one small observation. Traditionally, obviously, Scotland is a very educated and engaged nation, going back to the late 1600s. Amazing philosophers, economists, and scientists were born here. So it comes as no news to me that Scots and New Scots engage in a huge amount of reading, which is fantastic. But also, what's great is that you have a very general sense of solidarity, which I think differentiates it from other places. And it's good to see that it is acknowledged by the people. And not only that, but they also rejoice in it, and they invest themselves in it and educate their children in that direction. It's a great message.
And our final story today, Public Health Scotland today published a review of early child development statistics for 2018-90, showing improvements in some areas, although being born into a more deprived household still leaves children significantly more likely to experience developmental difficulties. In 2018-19, 15% of children receiving a 27 to 30 month review had some concern expressed about an area of their development. This is a decline from 19% in 2014. 22% of children from the most deprived areas had a concern expressed, almost 3 times as many as the 8% of children from least deprived areas. Boys were around twice as likely as girls to have concerns expressed, and children looked after by a local authority were twice as likely as others to have concerns expressed. Rates of concerns expressed about looked after children have fallen though. And Richard, obviously the impact of these kind of problems in early development can be lifelong. So any reduction is a good sign. There are still quite a way to go, particularly in closing that gap between the most and the least deprived, isn't there?
Absolutely, and I think I was very taken with a lot of what Effie had to say in the previous item, and it's great that it's great to get that perspective, and I think we have a lot that we can be very proud about in the way that society functions in Scotland. But one of the long running sores has been persistent inequality, and we often talk a good game in Scotland, but we're less good at tackling that systemic, often endemic at times, inequalities. Now, devolution hasn't perhaps lived up to all of the expectations that people had of it. Of course, there are some very significant powers that can be used to to redistribute wealth, to redistribute opportunities, to level up, to use that a phrase that's involved down here, and they remain outside the grasp of Scottish ministers of whatever hue. So I think that remains there to be tackled. While it's good that the gaps are closing, and I think there are things we can do. I think the baby box in particular is not just it's good in its own terms, but it's also helping with the parental skills, with the advice and the information and signposts new parents too. It's perhaps helping to engage parents, and particularly dads. I think that's a really important part of the developmental process, and the family unit engaging fathers with their children as well. And when I remember rural Aberdeenshire, when we had our girls, I would, on a Friday morning, that was my morning with the girls, to take them out to the local parent and toddler group, and I wouldn't quite say I was looked at as if I had two heads for being the only father in the room, but that's sometimes how it felt a bit like. So there's a whole range of societal attitudes that feed into the equalities agenda, but fundamentally there are some structural inequalities there that only the powers over the welfare system, allied to the ambition to do something about it, can start to shift. But while these figures are encouraging, particularly the figures around about the looked after children, as councillors we were always had it drummed into us that we too were corporate parents, and we had a responsibility to make sure. A couple of councillors in Aberdeenshire were appointed by the looked after children themselves as champions of looked after children. Having to think about how everything we did, how that would impact on them. That's all good, seeing those changes in the indicators for the better, but we've still got an awful lot of work to do. No matter how good we think we might be, no matter how good we want to be, there's still a significant gap between the reality and what we should be aiming for. And it's incumbent on all of us to try and do more in politics to try and close that gap.
Well, that is an excellent place to end. So I would like to thank Richard and Effie very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have both of them. And thank you at home for joining us as well. The whole point of these shows is to have an audience for them. So thank you once again. Our audience has grown somewhat in the last couple of weeks. So especially to our new viewers, welcome. But if you are a new viewer, you may not have heard me do this bit before. This is the bit where I ask for your money. If you are able to support Broadcasting Scotland, then do please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up there as a supporter. This is our only major source of funding. It is how we keep things going here at Broadcasting Scotland. So if you do value having this as a new, better broadcaster for Scotland, then do please support us if you can. If you're not able to support us financially, we absolutely understand, and please don't worry, the shows will always be free to view online. But you can still make a big difference for us by being our marketing team. You can follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. You can find us on Facebook, find our channel on YouTube, like those pages, that channel, click the bell icon on YouTube to make sure you get updated when we release a new video. And then share the shows around. Let people know why you support Broadcasting Scotland. We don't spend a penny on marketing right now, and so we rely very much on you to get the word out there. So do please let people know that you support Broadcasting Scotland and why they should as well. And finally, we're always looking for new people here at Broadcasting Scotland as well. We've talked about this a bit on social media in the last few days, but there's a lot of work we'd love to be able to do that we just can't until we have more hands to do it. So if you're interested in getting involved in helping us build Broadcasting Scotland, then do please get in touch by any of those social media methods. Our email address is on the website as well. Just get in touch, let us know what your interest is, and we will find a place for you here. But that is absolutely all we have time for tonight. So once again, thank you very much to Richard Thomson MP and to Effie Samara. I'll be back again tomorrow with another Scotland at 7. But until then, have a great evening. Good night.